So thank you all for joining us today. I'm not sure where everyone's joining in from, but I'm here in northern Arizona, northeastern part of the state in St. Michael's, Arizona, and it has snowed this morning, so I am definitely enjoying the winter weather. But so hopefully everyone, if you are enjoying similar type of weather, I hope all of you are indoors and warm with your favorite warm beverage in hand. But for this next hour, I definitely want to just embark on a little journey in discussing intimate partner violence amongst the specifically Native LGBTQ2S community. But before I really jump into that, let me go ahead and formally introduce myself. Yat Eshe Begaye Nisha, Hashgal Hanslo and Shla, Tohe Glini Bushes Chin, Nashgala Esha Chedo, Glashche Eshanella. My name is Kurt Begaye. I am Navajo of the Yucca Fruit Shanga Online clan, born for Water Flow Together clan. My maternal grandfather is of the Mescalero Apache clan, and my paternal grandfather is of the Red Bottom people. And so that is how I identify as Navajo. And my work with intimate partner violence really is currently situated as an independent consultant. Prior to me embarking on this journey as an independent consultant, I was working with one of the 18 funded tribal coalitions, the coalition here, the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, that's funded for servicing the tribes in Arizona. I was the former director of training and technical assistance with SWIG. So I was with them for about 2.5 years as a full-time employee, but then prior to that, had been working with them as an independent consultant, specifically on this particular topic, but also looking at other intersectionalities with LGBTQ and victim services. And so looking at how all of these other social determinants of health intersect with this particular topic and with this particular community. And so have been working in this field of victim services for approximately 6 to 7 years now, predominantly as an independent consultant, but specifically providing training and TA to tribal organizations across the country. So like as I was saying earlier, and for those of you who just joined us, we will be discussing intimate partner violence or IPV amongst the Native LGBTQ relationships. And so when we talk about LGBTQ relationships, we're talking about a spectrum of identities. And so many times, some of you may be familiar with this rainbow, the rainbow flag that's affiliated with our community, but also some of you may be familiar with the acronym LGBT. Some of you may be familiar with LGBTQS, but there's also this longer acronym here. And I put this out there to start off with because I want us to really start to think of the community that we're going to be discussing, but also understanding that when we look at individual identities, they start to become more diverse in terms of how individuals are self-identifying, whether that be from a sexual orientation perspective or even from a gender identity perspective. So I'm showing you this if you would like to write down this particular acronym and see if we can start to define some of these identities as we move along through the course of our session here. But it's something that is fairly new, really just being able to try to encapsulate all the identities that are known now. But some of you, for ease of use purposes, some people may say LGBTQ2S or LGBT plus. And the plus sign just really accounts for all of these other identities that are listed here because again, when we start talking in acronyms, it becomes alphabet soup, and trying to say LGBTQSQQIAP on a regular basis will become a little challenging. So for the sakes of ease of use, oftentimes folks will just indicate and use the acronym LGBT plus. So again, we will move into this a little bit after we dive in. And again, this is coming from a very westernized perspective. So when we talk about Native communities, we have to really take a step back and look at how is sexuality and gender orientation, how was sexual orientation and gender identity defined within tribal communities historically prior to Western colonization and Western contact. And so what we see here is that if you go across the country and talk to the various tribal communities, many tribal communities still remember the terms that historically were utilized for individuals who I like to say were third or fourth gender, meaning that they were beyond just the typical known a binary of male or female, but many tribes recognize multiple gender identities. Some tribes even upwards of 36 various genders within their tribal society makeup. And so again, like I was saying, they have specific terms for individuals who were from these different categorizations. So like amongst the Crows, it was the term that was utilized was bote. From the Lakota, winkte. From my tribe, Navajo, we have nuglehe, or nuglehe can be used as a generalized term, but also was more for the male-bodied individual. And so when we look at the female-bodied individual, it was more, the term there was dilba. And so we have specific terminology, because if you think back within Native culture, if we did not have a name for it, it didn't necessarily exist within our society. And so for third and fourth gendered individuals to have a particular name and a particular space within our community makeup really goes back and illustrates that tribal communities historically had a place for individuals who are third and fourth gender, recognize these individuals, and many times recognize them as being special. Oftentimes these individuals took space as healers, as traditional practitioners, of name givers, even some as warriors and chieftains. So we definitely were embedded within our cultural teachings, within our societies. And so having a name really is the first step in recognition. And so I love the fact that many of our tribes across the country and even our Pacific Islands had names for third and fourth gendered individuals. And so to really kind of illustrate the point here, I wanted to take some time to look at what that looked like within the Navajo context. And so this work here, this matrix that you see here is representative of work conducted by Dr. Wesley Thomas back in the late 90s. He went in across the Navajo reservation speaking with elders who, for the purpose of his research, these elders spoke very little English, maybe even did not speak English at all. So these were individuals who are very embedded in the Navajo traditional way of life, way of thinking. And so what Dr. Thomas did was really wanted to get a grasp and handle on what the gender system would look like within a Navajo society. And so you see here that the first row is our gender status, and utilizing the terms that we as Navajos utilize for these various gender classifications that you see as the headers for the columns in the darker blue. So women being a sa, female or female-bodied individuals who would be seen as third gendered would be nugle. Hermaphrodites, and this is an older term. Again, nowadays the new term is intersex, but again, during the time of his research, the term he used was hermaphrodite, and that's for someone who had this mixed genitalia or mixed biological makeup of both male and female. And so again, the generalized term here was also nugle. Male or male-bodied individuals, nugle, and the man would be husteen. And so when we look at this from a Western lens, our binary would be man and woman. And so that would be husteen and asa. But from a Navajo gender system, we're utilizing 3 different gender identities here. And so as you go down through the table, you see in terms of like demeanor, whether it be more masculine or feminine or even androgynous, occupation, again, for the sake of this research, Dr. Thomas was using more of a binary approach to this matrix. And so masculine and feminine, and for more generalized occupation, weaver for more of a female role, hunter more for a masculine role. And then you look at the biological sex or the natal sex, female-bodied, male-bodied, and mixed genitalia. But then when we start to look at relationships, that's where it starts to get different, where things begin to change from what he discovered. And so you see here again, utilizing those same classifications of feminine female, masculine male, Asa and Hastin, then masculine female, Nagle, feminine male, Nagle, and you start to compare them and comparing them to see, coupling them up to see what was the thought process from the traditional Navajo point of view. And you see that a feminine female and another feminine female, Asa with another Asa, that relationship was seen as being inconceivable. A feminine female Asa with a masculine male, Hastin, that was seen as again, utilizing Western concepts, was seen as a heterosexual relationship, was seen as something that was acceptable. But then when we look at feminine female, Asa with a masculine female, Nagle, you see that that relationship was also seen as acceptable. Now, why is that? You may be wondering. So when we dive more into Navajo culture, we see that there is this concept of hojon, or beauty, or being in balance. And part of being in that approach to balance is having both a feminine energy and a masculine energy represented. And so that is seen as being in harmony and in balance. And so you see someone here who is taking on a feminine role, the Asa, with someone who's taking on a masculine role, Nagle, the masculine female, the Nagle. So that relationship, having both feminine and masculine represented, was seen as being acceptable, that was a balanced relationship. And it wasn't necessary, and it wasn't about the sex per se, it was about the role the individuals took within their society and how they were accepted and perceived within the society, within the family, and within the community makeup. And so nowadays, we really approach this from what's between the legs, from a sexual perspective and a sexual point of view. And that's why we always talk about sexual orientation. But from, at least from the Navajo, traditional Navajo society and traditional Navajo thought process, it was about what was your role in their community? And then from there, how do you integrate and how do you relate to other people within your community and within your society? And that was seen, that was the approach to balance, that was the approach to hojon. And so you see, when you start to pair up the different headers in the columns within this, and also the row headers, that you see that some relationships were seen as being inconceivable, others were seen as a balanced relationship. And some were also seen that may not have been necessarily as acceptable, but were that did happen and was, but that occurrence was very rare. But again, it goes back to illustrating how the different relationships between the different unions between two individuals were accepted across the board, regardless of natal sex, but it was really about your role that you took within your society. And so here's some individuals from history who we see as being some of the more prominent individuals who were from that third and fourth gender categorization. So from the Pueblo Zuni, we have Wiwa, the first individual listed here. And Wiwa was, again, born male, but presented herself and the role that she took within her pueblo, within her village, was that of a female. And so was seen as a spiritual leader. And one of the things I love to talk about with Wiwa was that when it came time for the Pueblo Zuni to send a delegation to Washington, DC to meet with the president, the delegation consisted of Wiwa, and she was the representative of the village. And so that really denoted her prominence and her level of prominence and her degree of acceptance within her village for them to send her as the delegation and the representative for her village to the government of the United States of America. And so that was a high recognition for her. The next person to be illustrated here in this slide is Hastin Claw from my tribe. Hastin Claw, again, born male, but the unique thing about Hastin Claw was that he was also a traditional practitioner, but he was an artisan, he was a weaver. And one of his notes to prominence was that he was one of the co-founders of the Wheelwright Museum outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, which has a great collection of art pieces from various tribes across the country, and many of Hustine Claw's own rug weavings are stored there at the museum. But another thing that Hustine Claw is noted for is taking the concept of merging his two roles of a traditional practitioner with that of a weaver, to begin to capture sand painting designs on rug weavings, on tapestries. And if you know anything about sand paintings they have a ceremonial purpose, and the sand painting is designed and is created for that ceremony. And then once the ceremony is over, that sand painting is then destroyed, because it's part of the purpose of that sand painting is to absorb some of that negative energy that the patient is having. And so by destroying the sand painting, you also destroy that negative energy. And so what was happening when Hustine Claw was starting to weave those designs into his tapestries, that was seen as a very bad thing, that was seen as taboo. But in his role as a traditional practitioner, Hustine Claw was able to then start to develop the songs and ceremonies that would go along with weaving these types of designs into tapestries. So he really was able to make a significant shift within our Navajo people's way of design and thought process for this particular rug weaving tapestry. So very prominent and very meaningful for our society. The last person here that we're noting, that I'm depicting, is Pine Leaf from the Crow Nation. And Pine Leaf, again, born female, lived her life as a warrior, definitely was on the warrior trail, went into battle with her tribe against other tribal communities, but also against the United States government. And one thing of prominence was that she began to be recognized as a leader, as a chieftain, and as part within Crow society, the more wives you had, the greater prominence you had as a chief. And to note, it was recorded that Pine Leaf had 3 wives that we were aware of. And so really showed her escalation in the hierarchy of chieftainhood within her society. So again, these individuals, although born, have one particular natal sex, live their life in the roles in an opposite gender to that of what they were born. And so she really shows that diversity in terms of tribal communities, in terms of gender and sexual orientation. And so really we're able to live and be respected, but also not have who they were be a deficit to them. So I really want to take some time to step back and look at these, because I wanted us to get our mind kind of working around what is gender identity and sexual orientation like from a traditional perspective within tribal communities versus that of modern day society. Here's another term that some of you may be familiar with, Two-Spirit. It's a contemporary term that was developed by and for Native LGBTQ identified individuals. And it was created in 1990 at an international conference in Canada, where individuals came together and were really having this dialogue of trying to find a term that they could use to help to elevate and be seen and recognized within the broader LGBTQ community, but also a way for the community to be recognized within even modern day Native communities, because of colonization, the concept of third and fourth gender individuals, the naming and the ceremonies that were associated with individuals from who were third or fourth gendered oftentimes have been lost because of colonization, because of the impacts of historical trauma and boarding schools and all of that, going back to the whole save the man, kill the Indian. So really just being able to, a lot of that history and storytelling was lost during that time. And so this group of individuals was really trying to find a term that could be used, irregardless of which tribe you came from, that could be recognized internally within tribal communities, but also externally within the broader LGBTQ community. And so the conversation started there in Canada, but then also the following year in San Francisco, there was a follow-up conversation to really look at this term and see, is this something that would resonate with all tribal communities? And when they were looking at stories and legends and songs and ceremony for third and fourth gendered individuals, it was about individuals having both male and female energies. And so it was that balance there, and hence the term two-spirit. And it was accepted there, and it slowly started to gain momentum as the years progressed. But then once we started to take this term two-spirit to individual tribal communities and try to start to translate the term two-spirit into our own individual languages, that's where some of the challenges came up, where when you translated this term two-spirit, depending on the tribe, the term now was translated into as being the individual being a ghost or being a witch, or being, in some cases, a woman with an infant, a pregnant woman who is carrying a child. And so that's two spirits within one body. Another was, and within my tribe, since we talk about that concept of Hosho and balance, each Navajo individual has a female side and a male side, and because of that, we are in harmony. And so what to say that you are two-spirit starts to be translated as the individual is being possessed, that they have the spirit that they were born with, but then an outside spirit also is living within their body. And so because of that, they are in imbalance and will need a ceremony to push and exercise that outside spirit away from the individual. So again, so depending on the tribal community, the term, once you translate it into their language, could take on a negative connotation. So because of that, we like to tell individuals that allow the person to self-identify. If they identify as being gay, go with that. If they identify as being two-spirit, then utilize that. But don't just automatically assume that, oh, you're Native, you're LGBT, you must be two-spirit, because in doing so, you may have inadvertently called them a witch, a ghost. You may have said that they're dead or that they're possessed. So really, the cautionary point here is just to allow individuals to self-identify. And also, we have seen that individuals who are non-Native have started to utilize this term because in their mind, they feel that they have a kinship to Native communities, and because of that, they want to say that they're two-spirit. Or I have also heard individuals say that, well, in one of my past lives, I was Native, and so because of that, I want to identify as two-spirit. And that's not how this term was developed or was meant to be utilized. So it's a term that was created by Natives for Natives, and if you are not Native, then you cannot use this term. So again, for those of my non-Native participants on this webinar, please be an ally and advocate for that, and recognize and call out individuals if they are misusing this term in that fashion. So moving from traditional perspective to a more contemporary westernized version of gender identity and sexual orientation, some of you may have seen this particular infographic called the Gender Unicorn. What it is it's a way for us to start to explain gender expression, gender identity, and how that gender is being expressed by an individual, sex assigned at birth, and then the attraction that people have with one another, whether it be on a just more of friendly attraction or more of an intimate sexual attraction. So we start out with, let's start out with sex assigned at birth, and that really has to, you see here, it's depicted with the chromosome, and on the unicorn itself is generally associated with your sexual genitalia, because that, when an infant is born, that is what we're utilizing to indicate, oh, congratulations, you have a healthy little girl or you have a healthy little boy. And so that's the first thing that we utilize, is that sex assigned at birth, whether it be female, male, or other, or intersex. And then from that, let's move to gender identity, which is depicted by the rainbow icon. And so that's, you see here in the unicorn, it's a thought bubble, because that's how the individual perceives themselves to be, whether that's more masculine or whether that's more feminine or some combination of both, or outside of that binary. And then we go to the green dot, which is gender expression, and that's the outward representation of that particular identity. And so for me, I identify as being a gay man. And so for having that identity as a cisgendered male, I also express that, especially when I'm working in professional settings or professional environments, to be outwardly representative, more masculine in terms of my dress and my attire. But my style of speech, my use of hand gestures may be seen a little more, to be a little more feminized. And so because of that, my expression, again, is not stagnant, it's not set. My gender expression moves along that spectrum between masculinity and femininity, because dependent upon where I may be, how I express my gender identity may fluctuate. And it also fluctuates with who I'm with. And so, and then we get to the heart, to the attraction that we feel with one another, whether it be a spiritual attraction, a romantic, sexual attraction. It's that attraction we feel with other individuals. It could be because of who they are in terms of their outward expression and appearance, and as far as their gender. It could be part of who they are as far as their sexual orientation. It could just be, I love the way you think. I love just how your mind works, and I'm attracted to that. So again, the attraction can be any one of these things, and that's we often indicate that by saying that that's your sexual orientation. And so because of that, because your sexual orientation can manifest in many different ways, we have a slew of different identities. We have individuals identifying as gay, you have individuals identifying as lesbian, as bisexual, as being sexually fluid, as being pansexual, asexual, polyamorous. And so these are just but a few of some of the sexual orientations out there. And so it's really about, again, that outward, how we identify in terms of that attraction with one another. So going back to my first slide of that acronym LGBTQ, QSQQIAP, some of those are listed here: gay, lesbian, bisexual, polyamorous, pansexual, asexual. So these are different sexual orientations that were depicted on that first slide. Asexual, if we take the prefix A, that means none or without. So being asexual, someone who identifies as being asexual is stating that they have no sexual attraction to another person. They can still have sex, the physical act of sex with another person, but there is no sexual attraction, no sexual desire that they are feeling with another person. Polyamorous is another newer term. It just talks about how individuals have attractions to, an individual may have an attraction to multiple people within a group setting and can have these intimate relationships with each of these individuals, but it's also consensual, and that everyone in that group setting is aware of one another and how the intimate relationships exist between each partner. That's different than being pansexual, where you're attracted to, an individual is attracted to any person out there, irregardless of how they may identify. And that's different from bisexual. Bisexuality is the attraction to an individual who identifies as male and an individual who identifies as female. So that's hence the prefix bi, whereas pansexual is all the different identities. And again, that's similar to being sexually fluid. Now, when we take that same connotation of diversity within sexual orientations, you see here a slew of different gender identities. Some of these may be new for you, some you may have heard before, but this is just but a few of the various gender identities that we know of out there. And as people evolve and as people begin to identify and come to terms with who they are, new terms may be coming up. I know that I mentioned that I identify as being gay. I grew up on the reservation. I had I had a social network of gay friends, trans friends, and then I worked within the HIV field after college, and so really working within the LGBTQ community. And so I was entrenched in it. I lived my life with it. I identified as a member of the community. Then I moved to San Francisco, which the gay mecca of the LGBTQ community, right? Or one of the gay meccas and like the motherland. And so I moved there thinking, well, I'm from the community. I know my community. I had this lived experience being a part of the community. I know my stuff. I know the community, so I should fit right in there. But then I met someone who identified as genderqueer. And then that stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, wait, what do you mean genderqueer? What do you mean by that? And so then became more education. So you can be from the community, but that doesn't necessarily mean you know all the facets of the community. We're still learning ourselves because again, like I stated earlier, new terms are coming up. So it's just a way of constantly trying to educate and being able to ask the question, well, what do you mean by being omnigender? What does that mean for you? And how do I, as a service provider, as an ally, as a friend, as a family member, how do I recognize you in that identity and how do I interact with you? So really just being able to have those types of honest dialogue with individuals so that we begin to understand who they are. And it's a way of saying, I see you, because oftentimes those of us who are coming from the LGBTQ community have lived our lives so much in the closet or in hiding that for you to ask those questions and to be able to say, I see you, I recognize you, and I'm willing to refer to you as you want to be referred to as, that goes a long way in terms of building that trust, establishing that type of relationship. So really just being able to ask those questions and say, okay, well, you're ambigender, but I'm cisgender. So how do we have this relationship? How can we move forward working together? How can we develop a friendship? How do we become, how can we move forward in a way that's both respectful for both of us in this new relationship? So again, a lot of new terms. Again, you're not going to become an expert overnight. Just like I had shared, I'm still learning as these new terms come up and these new ways of identifying come into play. I'm still learning. And so, especially when it comes to pronouns, when we talk about, I know growing up, oftentimes we were taught he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs for a group. But then now we have individuals saying, refer to me as they, them, theirs. My pronouns are ze, here, hers. So for many of us, what do you mean by that? For me, I had one individual who I knew her when she identified as female. And then one day after living her truth, came up to me and said, well, Kurt, please refer to me as they, them, theirs. And so it took me a while, whenever I would refer to them, it took me a while to make that shift, especially in my mind, mentally, to make that shift from she, her, hers to they, them, theirs. And so I was constantly having to check myself and say, Kurt, no, remember they, them, theirs. And so because I had that pre-existing relationship with this individual, it took a while for me to make that change. And so I know that for many of you, that may be something you're dealing with too, is having known an individual or individuals in one way, and then now having to switch gears and refer to them in a new way. We're all going through that. But for me, it seems less challenging now because I've had many years to make that shift in thought process. And so as I interact with new individuals, it's easier for me to grasp their pronouns and really being able to navigate that that whole process, and especially with my service provision to individuals in the community. So I just want you to know that it will take some time, but just be willing and just be honest, especially if you slip up, just be honest and say, I'm sorry, I know you told me this. I'll do my best. I'm still learning to make this shift. So I may slip up again in the future, but no, it's not coming from a negative space, that I am trying to learn. And so recognize, apologize, and we'll move on. Don't make a big deal of saying, oh my God, you told me this and I made this mistake. I know this is what you want to be referred to as. I know these are your pronouns, I know this is your gender. I am so sorry, I am so sorry. That's just going overboard. And we're just gonna be like, you know what, just move on, just go away. So just really be honest with that, recognize it, acknowledge it, apologize, and move on. I think that's the best advice I could give you in those situations. And so now let's talk about some of the violence that's occurring within the LGBTQ community. And what does that look like? How does that differ from violence between a heterosexual cisgender couple? And so a lot of it stems from, again, going back to that concept of hiding or being in the closet. And so oftentimes what may happen in these situations is this threat of outing one of the individuals in the relationship, whether that be the abuser, their fear of being outed because they may be seen as being heterosexual within the society. And so the idea of being caught in the same-sex relationship is just really troublesome for them. And so because of that, they will do everything in their power to ensure that their partner does not give voice to that. And so that's the violence may stem from that. Or it could be that the victim is not out. And so the perpetrator is using that against them. So oftentimes the violence may stem from this sense of outing, either the one or more of the partners there. And so, and also just, we see that victims, LGBTQ victims, are very hesitant to report the act of violence that they have just may have experienced from their partner or one of from an intimate partner or someone, their lifelong partner, because again, the system isn't perfect, and the system hasn't been has not historically recognized same-sex relationships. And so because of that, again, going back to outing, that may be one thing, but also the system. What I've seen in the work that I have been doing over the course of the years, many law enforcement officers don't recognize same-sex relationships. They may not see that what's happening between these two individuals is stemming from an intimate place. And so they respond to a call of violence. They go and they see it's two men. And so then they're like, well, you guys just don't hang out with each other. You guys stop, just don't be friends with one another. You go to your house, you go to your place, or if you have another place to go to, just leave each other alone and go. And don't even take the time to investigate and see if this is an intimate partner relationship. And so oftentimes law enforcement may not even be recognized and trained to recognize the relationship. For those of you who watch Queer Eye, the newest release of Queer Eye, Karamo Brown, he has a book out, and in that book he talks about the domestic violence that was happening with him and his partner, where he was the perpetrator, and how he, to make the long story short, had physically assaulted his partner. The partner left, then proceeded to destroy his partner's apartment, and waited in that destruction until the partner came back, and the partner said, well, you need to get out or I'm gonna call the cops. And Karamo's response was, go ahead, they're not gonna do anything about it. And when the story proceeds, that's exactly what happened. The police came in and just said, well, you guys shouldn't hang out, you guys shouldn't be friends, and did not take the time to recognize this as a domestic situation. So that's something that really keeps many LGBTQ individuals from reporting the violence that they're experiencing. Or especially with trans individuals, there's this concept that many of them may be sex workers, and so now, or may have a warrant for previous sex work in their past. And so for her to then make the report to police, and then they do their investigation, they see that she has this warrant out, then she gets arrested for the warrant, even though in this particular situation, she was the victim of a violent situation or a violent occurrence. And so because of that, then there's that fear of, well, should I really call the police because I might get caught, or I might get thrown in, or even, well, they may not even, they may just arrest both of us because they don't know who started the fight. And so the police are just gonna arrest both individuals in this situation. So there's all these things within the system that really keep an individual from reporting the violent situation that they may have been experiencing. And so, and especially if there's like children involved, and if the child is, if one of the individuals within the relationship is the biological parent of the child, then, and that person is the abuser, then chances are the child's going to continue to stay with that abusive individual. And so there's that fear of those types of situations that may happen. So again, we really need to peel back those layers in terms of our own knowledge of what intimate partner violence looks like from a cisgender heterosexual perspective, and really begin to see, okay, how does this change for two men, for two women, for a transgender individual, for a gender nonconforming or gender variant individual? What does this intimate partner violence situation look like for them in that situation? One of the victim advocates that I've worked with in the past, she made this comment that, well, I don't treat the victims any different. A victim is a victim. So I work with them from that standpoint, which is great. I think we standardized the approach in terms of our victim services and how we as advocates may work with the victim. That shouldn't change, but recognize that in dealing with an LGBTQ individual, there's added layers. And that's where the difference comes into play is the pronouns, is the partner, is the situation of being out, of past experience with law enforcement. These are different layers that an advocate should start to take into consideration as they're working with the victim. Because again, standardizing the type of services is great, but then you also need to recognize that there's added layers for individuals from this particular community. I think I've talked about this as well. Also, especially within tribal communities, victim services have been developed for women. I mean, the act itself, Violence Against Women, all the federal funding that comes out of that particular act is geared towards women as victims. And that's great because that's how the act started, and that's how this whole movement started. But as we start to recognize that violence is happening across the board, irregardless of gender identity, we now need to start to look at, okay, how is our organization equipped to handle these situations? I've done work where with men who have experienced violence, cisgender heterosexual men who were victims in an intimate partner situation, but they don't want to come up and present and share their story because and report this situation because the system isn't created for them as victims. It's created for them as perpetrators. So that's one blockage for them to report the situation and seek services. Same with LGBTQ individuals. Where do we put a gay man who is a victim of a domestic situation if all the services within the community are set up for women as victims? Where do we put a transgender individual or a gender nonconforming individual? So really, we need to also take a step back and say, okay, how can we change our system? How can we change the system and provide these needed resources for individuals? If we want to say we want to provide services for all of our community members, then we also need to have those resources to back that particular type of proclamation. So it's just really being able to take a step back and say, okay, what do we need to have in place? And just recognizing that domestic violence happens across the board in all types of relationships. Now, in doing this work, there are some myths that have come up that LGBTQ intimate partner violence is rare. And that's coming again from a historical lens, from a heterosexual lens, where domestic intimate partner violence is only between cisgendered heterosexual couples. The reason why we think it's rare is because individuals from the LGBTQ community have not come forward to report the IPV or the violence that they may have experienced for all these different facets. Another myth is that LGBTQ intimate partner violence is less severe. Some statistics that I have read state that the violence perpetrated against a gay male individual in an IPV situation is 3 times more intense than a cisgender heterosexual male. So, and oftentimes, more often than not, a gay man who has experienced IPV is going to need medical attention more so than that of their heterosexual counterpart, or even more so than some of their female counterparts. So we also need to recognize and look at what is happening when the violence is occurring, when it is reported and captured and logged in, what's the degree and of severity of the violence that's being inflicted upon the victim? Because that's the only way we can begin to debunk these myths, but also make a state for the needed services within our particular jurisdiction for LGBTQ victims of violence. When another myth is that the abusers in an LGBTQ relationship are masculine. And again, that's looking at it through a cisgender heterosexual lens to violence, that oftentimes it's the male who is the perpetrator onto a female victim. And so because of that, we are conditioned to see when we come upon an instance of IPV within an LGBTQ relationship, we often look to see who is the more masculine, who is the more physically fit, who is the more physically dominant individual within that relationship. They must be the perpetrator, and the other less intimidating partner is more than likely the victim. Chances are it could be flipped, and chances are more likely that it's flipped as well. So we need to just take that lens off, take those glasses off, and look at this, how it's presented, ask those questions, and really do our due diligence and ensure that we are identifying the proper abuser and the proper victim in this particular situation, and not just with what some law enforcement officers do, arresting both of them and just saying, let's take you both in because you are now disturbing the peace. So let's really be able to do our due diligence and take a step back and really say, okay, what is happening in this situation? Again, another myth is that LGBTQ IPV is just the same as any other IPV out there. I think I made a case for that to debunk that there are all these layers to the relationships that make it different and more challenging in some cases than cisgender heterosexual IPV. And this last myth, that LGBTQ IPV should not be discussed. Now, oftentimes what is happening, again, going back to the funding and to the OVW, the Violence Against Women Act, that those endorsers of the act really say, well, the funding and the act and the movement is really for violence against women, and we shouldn't really discuss this. And by discussing this, oftentimes they may say, well, this gives evidence and gives backing to those individuals who have an argument that it's not just violence against women and we shouldn't just focus on that anymore. So there's all of this back and forth in terms of why LGBTQ IPV should not be discussed. And also from a funding situation, we know that many victim service programs are maybe nonprofit organizations, and so their funding is heavily coming from the Violence Against Women Act. And to say that, and to begin to start to talk about LGBTQ IPV, then some may say, well, that takes funding away from the needed services for women, for female victims of violence. And so there's all these different types of arguments for why the violence against LGBTQ individuals should not be discussed. Another from tribal communities that I've been working with, especially smaller communities, they just don't want to be seen as having an issue with LGBTQ violence and victimization on their tribal lands, or even to recognize that LGBTQ individuals exist on the reservation and live on the reservation. I've had both statements being shared with me when I've worked with tribal communities in various areas, and where individuals say, well, oh, we don't have a problem with that, or we don't have LGBTQ individuals living here. So again, it's very interesting to have had these types of statements being shared with me from providers. This may look familiar to you, power and control wheel, and this is the power and control wheel for LGBTQ relationships. And the difference here is looking really at the transphobia, homophobia, biphobia. We have a spoke for heterosexism. We also have talk a lot about HIV-related abuse. And so the other spokes of this power and control wheel are going to be very similar, but those are the few that really stand out when we talk about LGBTQ violence. So really just being able to take the time to understand, what does homophobia mean and look like within my community? What does biphobia look like within my community? What does transphobia look like within my community? And how do we, as a community, respond from a heterosexist point of view? So really just being able to identify those and really begin to start to navigate and understand what those look like for our own jurisdictions. And I want to take some time for this, is looking at what are some of those predictors to LGBTQIPV perpetration. So in the darker blue box, these are just kind of those predictors across the board. We look at socialization. We talk about how, as a child who witnesses violence, that they may be predetermined to or predisposed to then either be an abuser in a relationship and really live out that type of abuse that they may have witnessed as a child, or if they were a victim of abuse before, they have a higher propensity to become a victim of abuse again in the future. So it's really talking about that type of socialization. When we look at power imbalance, it's again, who has the power, who has the control? Is it power in terms of finance? Is it power in terms of age? Is it power in terms of acceptance within the community? It's all of these different nuances, and how does that really factor into the violence within that particular relationship? We talk about dependency, we talk about justification, psychological traits, gender, and that's just not specific to LGBTQ relationships, but it's across the board. Now, when we look at those specific predictors for LGBTQ relationships, it's experiencing discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia. It's looking at how out are you in the community. Just walking down the street, can someone say, oh, there's a gay man, oh, there's a lesbian woman, oh, there's a trans individual, or do you pass within the society where no one thinks, oh, well, yes, that's definitely a gay man, or that's definitely a lesbian, or, oh yeah, that's definitely a transgender woman. Do you have that capability of passing within the society? So these are all different things that lend itself to perpetration within LGBTQ community or LGBTQ relationship. So when we, again, taking a step to look at socialization, really just looking at how are we conditioned as a society, how are we conditioned as individuals in regards to violence with our partners. So it's really looking at what has been our childhood experience, what has been experience in high school, what have been our experiences in college and after college. And so it's just really how have we been conditioned in our past to then make us more susceptible to violence in the future. Again, I think I've talked about this in terms of power imbalance. Some of the justifications that women do not have the capacity to hurt their partners. I think that's one of the misnomers out there, is that, oh yeah, well, two women in a relationship, that's going to be an easy relationship. It's two women. They talk about their emotions. They talk about their feelings. It should be hunky-dory in that particular relationship. And no, oftentimes For a while there on Navajo, when it came to same-sex relationships, we had a higher reporting of violence within two female relation or within a lesbian couple relationship. So again, it's not to say that women don't have that predisposition to hurt their partners, because that's another myth. Men always have the capacity to defend themselves. Again, well, they're men, they should be able to fight, they can handle their situation. Not all the times. I mean, hello, I was trained, I've taken karate so many years in my past and several different disciplines, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm gonna fight. I mean, I'm not predispositioned to fight. It's not something that I do. So, but I have that knowledge in my tool belt to then say, well, I can defend myself if need be, but that's not the first thing I'm gonna go to. It's like my fight or flight reflex. Flight is predominant in my book. Fight is the last thing that I would do. So again, it's just a misnomer that we definitely that these conditions or societal norms are not necessarily across the board for folks. Now, when we look at what keeps an individual from seeking help, so we look again. This may look familiar to a cisgender heterosexual relationship: dependency, aspects of fear, help-seeking barriers, not recognizing that you're in an intimate partner violence situation. I've had some of my trans friends say that, well, after having gone through some of the trainings that we provided, come to me and say, wow, I just realized that I was trafficked by one of my previous boyfriends. But to them, during that time, they thought it was just something that they were doing because that's what he wanted and that's part of their relationship dynamic. But then now in hindsight, looking at, like they say, hindsight's 2020, looking back, they now recognize, oh no, what he was doing was he was trafficking me. So it's really just being able to recognize and take the time to see and say, is this really happening to me? So how can we as providers improve our services? Training, webinars like this, full day sessions. The training that I used to provide started out as a webinar, then started out to 2-hour training session, a 4-hour training session, then it became a day-long session. And then before I left the coalition, we had a 2-day training that we were providing for providers across the state. And even that, they were participants in that training were saying, we need an extra day to go through all of this information that you're providing. So again, actively seek training that can help you in your professional development. Screening, being able to develop screening that captures information for LGBTQ individuals. Like this one here. You see where the arrows are, we have a patient alias, meaning what is your day-to-day name? What is the name? What is your use name? What name do you want me to call you? What is your nickname? Because oftentimes, like my birth certificate, my driver's license say Kurt Begaye, but when I'm coming to you, I might want to be called something else. So just really having space to capture that. So if you are not providing services to the individual in the future, at least whoever, because you may be out or what have you, whoever from your office pulls the file and begins to have interact with the patient or with the victim, then you can see it's depicted here. This is the name that they would like to be called. So really having space for that. Sex at, you see the next arrow, we have a space that says sex at birth, male and female. Then we have a space for current gender, male, female, transgender, male to female, transgender, female to male, unknown, other gender specify. So this gives room for individuals to check. And you may not have space on your intake form for all of these different identities. You could just say current gender and leave the line and let them self-identify and fill in sexual orientation and leave that line instead of saying heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, gender fluid, and all of these other things. You may not capture everything, so just be having a shortcut to that could just be having the line there and allowing that individual to self-identify. When we talk about safety planning, looking at, okay, and this again across the board, what are some things you want to consider if the individual would like to remain with the abuser, and how can they try to alleviate the the frequency of the violence, or how could they just really cope with that if they choose to remain with the perpetrator. And then if they choose to leave, what are some things that they need to consider? And again, just remembering that the most dangerous time for a victim is when they plan to leave their perpetrator. And that's the same across the board, regardless of your gender identity, sexual orientation. So really just having these tips in place to then say, okay, these are some considerations. How can I as a victim advocate, how can I work with you to develop a safety plan for yourself if you choose to remain or if you decide to leave? So just really having that type of checklist for yourself and for your organization that you can then provide to the individual. Now, I mentioned the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition is one of 18 federally funded tribal coalitions, and all the tribal coalitions are funded to provide education, training, technical assistance, community engagement, and policy support to advocates within their jurisdiction. The great thing about this with SWIC, the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, is when I was working as a consultant with them prior to coming on board as a staff member, we created LGBTQ Advisory Council comprised of individuals from the LGBTQ community who could help inform and shape the services that SWIC was offering, but also to act as faculty for some of these training endeavors. So SWIC would be a great place for you to start and reach out to and really begin to utilize the members of their LGBTQ Advisory Council for some of these considerations as far as education, training, looking at your organization's policies and how to change some of these intake forms. They would be a great starting place for you to really begin to engage and have these conversations with. And so we will be sharing, Kelsey will be sharing my PowerPoint slides with you. So all of these websites will be listed. But that brings me to the end of my session here. So I'm not sure if we have questions, Kelsey.